Hey everybody, this is Nick from Nick's Listening Space, and today we're going to talk about the Arylic A100. So some reviews are easy. The product is clearly great or clearly flawed. This one, not so much. Because if I come at this from a full-on audiophile's mindset, I think that the A100 comes up a little bit short. So first of all, there's no Tidal Connect. There's no 24-bit streaming, and there's no digital output. So even if you wanted to upgrade your DAC later on, you can't. I think that the limitations are advertised right on the surface of the A100. But honestly, if I stopped evaluating this as an audiophile, as somebody with a wall full of vinyl, multiple DACs, and a drawer full of tubes, and I really asked the question, like, who is the A100 for? Then I think what we're going to find is that this is probably not for the haters in my comments. It's definitely not for someone with 4 DACs and a monthly Roon membership. I think that the A100 is for somebody just beginning their journey, and somebody who's probably just falling into this hobby and not yet drowning in it. And so once I looked at it through that lens, then I think that the whole product changes for me. Because honestly, after using the A100, I do think that this little device would make for a killer bedroom system. You know, it would also make for a great system for a teenager that's digging through their parents' CD and vinyl collection, you know, or even possibly for a college student that wants to have that real stereo experience, you know, without needing to have a full rack of components. And so on the surface, if I wanted to nitpick here, I would say that the A100 is inadequate because there is no Tidal Connect. But I think, honestly, for most beginners, probably all you need is Bluetooth, Spotify, and AirPlay. And in that regard, then the A100 nails it. Another aspect of this thing is that while I am a separates guy, I'm kind of loving the simplicity that the A100 gives me because, you know, when I think about my system and all its various components, there is kind of a desire to want to have less. You know, another aspect of the A100 is, at least for me, when I was 20 years old and I wanted to listen to digital music, back then we would just plug our iPods into our auxiliary port. At least then, you know, Bluetooth sucked and streaming wasn't really a mainstream thing. And so if something like this had existed when I first started getting into 2-channel audio, I honestly would have been very thrilled. And so from that perspective, I think the A100 is a really great device. And I'm not just shilling for the A100 because I want to be shilling for it. I really do genuinely believe that if you're somebody just getting into this hobby, this is a very cool device that I think you're going to appreciate. If we talk about its build quality, I think it's surprisingly really solid. And if I were only to be talking about the A100 on hardware alone, then I think this would be a much shorter conversation because the build quality is shockingly solid for what you're getting and what you're paying for. And so here's some statistics for you people to see, and I'll just post those on the screen. So now we'll talk about the front of the device. You can see on the front there is a USB port. It does unfortunately look a little bit cheap, but this is a real convenient way to be able to play music through a thumb drive. Your rocker switch is a very basic, off-the-shelf kind of switch, but it has a really nice, satisfying thunk to it. You know, the volume knob here is nothing crazy. It just sort of works. It does have some nice knurling to it, but it's nothing that you're going to get on a really premium analog kind of volume knob. The screen on here is a 2.4-inch display, and it's definitely not a premium screen, but there's probably nothing offensive about it as well. There's a number pad here, which is a little weird, but I think aesthetically it does bring a little bit of balance to the screen. The logo placement is okay. It could be a little bit better. It's not like the prettiest thing, and honestly, when it comes to putting logos on the front of equipment, I wish there was a little bit more attention to that. And if you're gonna do it, like, make it intentional, make it like a badge or, you know, an illuminated element, make it purposeful. Unfortunately, there is no headphone jack on this device, and I think that's a missed opportunity, because if we are to really consider an all-in-one device, I think a number of people today are going to want to have a headphone output, especially for playing video games or just nightly listening. When it comes to the chassis of this guy, there's nothing crazy here. This is what I think is just a stamped metal that's been folded. There's venting on the side. I never once felt like this was a device that ran hot. In fact, I think it's a really cool running device, which is kind of a bonus if you're concerned about excess heat. And honestly, the build quality kind of reminds me of an older NAD unit. It's kind of got that old utilitarian confidence to it. The feet on this guy are probably one of the more weaker aspects of its build quality. There are these really super cheap plastic discs on there, and I would have liked to have seen some nice rubber feet. But again, for this price point, it's not the end of the world, right? Now let's spin around and talk about the rear I/O. On the back of this guy, you're going to get a phono input, line in, RCA out. For its digital inputs, we're going to get a coax and an optical input, as well as a USB. On the USB, you can either play music through a thumb drive, or you can use it as a DAC hooked up to your desktop. This device also has an Ethernet, as well as Wi-Fi, as well as Bluetooth 5.0. And one of the more unique aspects of the A100 is it has an FM tuner inside of it. And on the subject of the FM tuner, I honestly did not have great results with the FM tuner. And I don't know if that's the antenna or what, but using the onboard antenna that came with it, I played around with this for a really long time trying to get a good clear signal. And I only was able to do that when I had the antenna fully extended and kind of placed in front of the window. I do think this is probably a result of the antenna that it comes with, and I do think you could probably get a better signal with a better antenna. And then, for binding posts, there's nothing crazy here. I've seen nicer binding posts. And then lastly, you get a standard IEC power cable port. Now, the major con here is that there's not going to be any digital output. And I think that that kind of stings if we're talking about using this device for a long period of time and possibly through several upgrade cycles. I think that digital output would have been a really nice feature to have and something I would like to see in a 2.0 update. The hardware here sets you up to expect something great, and I think that's what makes this next part very interesting. If we imagine being 17 or 19 again, and then being in a dorm room, perhaps you just got your very first turntable, maybe you just inherited one, maybe you bought a $50 Craigslist find, you want to have a real stereo, you want to have passive speakers, you want to have something that's also simple as well, but you most importantly, I think, want to have something that feels like hi-fi. And I think from that perspective, the A100 is almost a perfect device. It does have a legit ESS Sabre DAC. It's a ES9023P DAC chip. In addition to that, you get a Class D amp chip that delivers 100 watts into 8 ohms and then 60 watts into 4 ohms. I think as long as you're not chasing those 2% gains, then this is a device that will allow you to play records and then also feel immersed. We can compare this to the all-in-one plastic speakers that I think most people are going to start with. And compared to that, I think this is a much better way to start, because this allows you to feel like you're investing into a system and not necessarily like a gadget or a device. First of all, it's very affordable and it's very clean and simple. And it does invite you to kind of build a system around it. If we consider that powered speakers are a common entry point, but then they're also something that traps you because the amp is built into the speaker, so you can't upgrade anything piece by piece, right? So I think in that regard, the A100 breaks that boundary for starter equipment because it lets a beginner taste what a real component experience is like without having to spend a fortune. Now the A100 is going to be a little bit on the warmer side tonally, and so I want to talk a bit about the speaker pairings and how I've had this thing hooked up in my particular system. And so to start off with this guy, I really wanted to use it as an all-in-one device powering my ELAC Debut 3.0s. What we're going to get here is a very big, fun, and full sound. The ELACs have a lot of authority and weight to them. And almost at times there was almost a little too much low end. I think that the mid-range here was a little bit constrained, and I was desiring a little bit more of that sparkle on the top end. The way I would characterize this pairing is that this is a very fun, it's full, it has a lot of bass, and at times there was almost too much low end. I felt as though the mid-range is a little bit constrained here, and something I was desiring for was a little bit more of that top end sparkle. Now, when we switched over to my LS50s, I felt as though this had a much better synergy. And mostly because I would say the LS50s tend to run a little bit brighter. And so I felt as though the warmth of the A100 paired with, you know, the brightness of the LS50s created a very nice balanced sound. I also felt as though there was more air in this setup, and there was more space between instruments. And certainly with that extra energy on the top end, I was getting more clarity and more detailed. I'm not saying this was hyper detailed, and it certainly wasn't fatiguing, but I'm certainly getting more of that top end energy. For me, this was like the moment that I felt the A100 could actually be worthy of being called a hi-fi component, I guess, if it were, right? You know, but one of the things that I always think about with these all-in-one components is that while they advertise themselves as all-in-one components, you know, usually after 1 or 2 upgrade cycles, it's a question of what does that component then become, right? So it's advertised as a streamer, a DAC, a phono, amplifier, and an amplifier, but like, can you break that apart into these individual sections? You know, and so when it comes time to upgrade, you know, does the A100 just turn into a brick? Essentially, like, what is the final form for the A100 after you've upgraded components? And I think for me, the final form of the A100 is probably using it as a front-end component or a front-end preamplifier, streamer, DAC all-in-one. Essentially, that's probably my favorite way to use the A100. And so using it in this situation, what we're going to do is we're going to pair it with a separate amplifier. And so for the first test, we'll use the A100 as a digital all-in-one preamplifier of sorts, and then we'll feed the signal into a dedicated power amp and then into my ELACs. And so for this test, we're going to be powering my ELACs with the V3 monos. In my opinion, this is where the ELACs really woke up. Compared to the onboard amplifier, what we get here is much tighter bass, more control, more nuance, and better rhythm and more texture. And I think honestly, that is more of a characteristic of the Class D amplifier and what that will do for your speakers. But I do think in this situation or in this particular setup, I'm getting a better listening experience. Now Now for the last and final listening test, what I've done is I've once again used the A100 as an all-in-one preamp, and I've paired that with my line magnetic LM34IA tube amplifier, and then feeding my KEF LS50s. And in this situation, I'm sort of testing what the ceiling of this device could be. So, you know, the LS50 in this situation has a very sweet top end. You get a lot of the characteristics that I'm going to get with tubes, or at least what you would expect to get with tubes. There's an incredible bass performance here. There's in such a beautiful low end and everything that I would expect to get. I think the main thing here that is holding this system back is the DAC itself. Essentially, if we wanted greater resolution, we would need to get a better DAC. But in that regard, you know, what we get here, honestly, with EL34s is this incredibly gooey, emotional listening experience. It's super laid back and lush. Like, I honestly have been really in love with this setup. What you get is this gooey, emotional mid-range that makes you melt in the couch. And I think in this situation, then we don't really care about having 24-bit audio, because what we're going for is already an incredibly warm, emotional listening experience. We're not searching for analyticals. We're not looking to have this hyper-detailed mix. And so with this setup, I was literally able to listen to it for 8, 9, 10 hours throughout the entirety of a day, and never once did I feel fatigued. And I played this setup with every genre under the sun, from indie rock to dream pop to, you know, 70s rock and roll to jazz to lots of 90s hip hop. And in every one of those situations, I sort of felt as though this is an incredibly agreeable listening experience. There's not going to be fatigue, and I would essentially call the A100's signature comfortable. I think for a lot of people, this is going to be very much enjoyable, and you'd be surprised. So what are my final frustrations with the A100? Well, for me, it's the lack of Tidal Connect. I think the lack of 24-bit streaming and the lack of the headphone amplifier. I think those three things would have really set the A100 apart from so many other devices at this price category. And I think that having those features would have presented a little bit more usability and life in the product. But, you know, that frustration for me comes from somebody who's been an audiophile now for a very long time, and not somebody that's a beginner, right? Most people are not going to pay for a Roon membership, and most people are not even going to pay for a Tidal membership. And so somebody with a free Spotify account and, you know, a collection of records that their parents gave them, again, I think this is a really great device for that use case. You know, so my final verdict here is that if you're already deep into the world of hi-fi, I think there's better streamers out there for you. I think that if you're somebody that's chasing transparency or resolution or detail, then this probably is not for you either. If you're just starting off, or you're a teenager, or you're looking to buy this for a young person in your life, or maybe you just got a first turntable and you have a handful of records, and you're kind of dreaming of building out a system, then in that regard, this might be perfect for you. You know, the tonality of this thing is that it's warm and it's forgiving. I think it's easy to live with, and it will grow with you to a certain extent. So for the teenager, for the college student, or for that beginner who's building out their hi-fi system, I think that the A100 is a great place to start. And, you know, whether or not you guys agree with me or not, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up, hit that like button, subscribe, all of that jazz. And I'll see you next time, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.